just racial assumptions. For example, the argument that, hey, you know what? These guys should be happy. They're being fed and housed and given an education that we prescribe. Does that sound familiar to anyone? You know, go back to the original sin of this country. Those arguments have been used about black people since then, about African Americans since then. Now, am I claiming that that this is like slavery? No, I'm not. Obviously not. There's a big difference, and I'm not claiming that. But I'm talking about the underlying assumptions and the kinds of arguments I don't think are coincidentally used here that have always been used. It is interesting, as Stan Van Gundy mentions, that in baseball and in hockey, it's okay. You know, like those rules don't exist. Those are predominantly white sports. And football and basketball are predominantly African American. There's a much higher percentage of the kids. Now, that doesn't mean this doesn't always also affect white kids, particularly, you know, poor white kids. Because if you're poor, you're poor. You know, every day you wake up, it's a crisis. Any kind of unforeseen expense, the car breaks down. Every day you wake up into a crisis. So getting that money is a big deal, whether you're white or black. But we're speaking generally here. I think Stan Van Gundy is too, obviously. There are examples of white players in basketball and football who don't come from any kind of affluence or stability, who maybe would like to be, you know, go straight to the pros too. But we're talking generally, and generally this affects African Americans out of proportion in basketball and football. And finally, the idea of amateurism, and Will, I imagine you bristle at this stuff. And I don't think it's hard and fast. Again, I think these are unconscious racial assumptions that are made. But what is the appeal of amateurism? Because the NCAA and the NFL and the NBA in different ways work as a syndicate. The NCAA is essentially the de facto minor league and star-making machine. So not only do you have a minor league where you don't have to pay the players and they develop, but eventually they have TV exposure, et cetera, they become stars. Well, why is that? It's because the veneer of amateurism is appealing to people. Why do they have to enforce that they must not only be amateur while they play in the tournament, in other words, don't get paid for that tournament, but don't get paid, period, for the sport they play? You can play piano and still play, you know, and be involved in collegiate activities and also play professionally, right? But for basketball and football, for that stuff, you must be amateur at all times. You must never profit. Why is that? What is the veneer of amateurism really about? I'm going to get a little deep here. It's about a time before there were worldly concerns where you needed money. It is a regression into something before adulthood. And I think that's less threatening to people. And I think people like the quote-unquote purity of that. And that is also a theme, a racial theme, that has been recurrent throughout American history. Am I saying it's exactly the same thing here? No. But I do not think those themes are coincidentally here either.
Go ahead, Will.
Well, I don't know what all your expectations and predictions were from my point of view, Max, but I would imagine maybe some are correct, but the vast majority are wrong. I have a long history on this program and others of saying that I think the one-and-done rule is wrong. I think that people should be paid for their talents in this world, that you shouldn't consign people to giving away their very specific and unique abilities for free or for a previously determined price. I'm not for the one-and-done rule, but what I'm against is what Stan Van Gundy just did, and that is apparently having the ability to peer into, as you put it, Max, the unconscious motivations of people and why they make it. I do not think the one-and-done rule is racist. I think it's motivated by much more simple things, like the color green. The thing is this, Stan Van Gundy doesn't know. By the way, we need to clarify this really quickly as well. The one-and-done rule, that's an NBA rule, not an NCAA rule. That's an agreement between the NBA Players Association and the NBA. So when you're attributing motivations to people, you first need to recognize who you are even talking about. So the allegation is being made against the NBA. Now, why would the NBA and NBA Players Association want to agree to a one-and-done rule? I'll give you two reasons. Number one, David Stern said when he adopted this rule, he didn't think young players were ready. Okay? He didn't think that 18-year-olds were ready to be on the NBA circuit with 25-year-olds. And the NBA Players Association is motivated by something else. And that's keeping young guys out so older guys have jobs. That's what unions do. They keep new people from taking old people's jobs. That's what it is. So you want motivation? It's ageism and it's anti-capitalism. It's forcing young people out to protect older players' jobs, and it's keeping people from getting paid. I don't like that. I'm against those kind of things. But I don't think race has anything to do with it.
Well, here's where I disagree with you, Will. I think that Stan Van Gundy's right on the money. I just don't think the NCAA was the appropriate target. Based on what you're saying, there are a plethora of other targets that he could have aimed his ire at, as opposed to the NCAA as it pertains to this particular rule. He's speaking about things from a societal perspective, how things are inhaled and how things are ultimately expressed and disseminated to the masses in terms of people's ire about certain rules and regulations that exist and certain rules and regulations that don't. Like when he brings up the comparison of the NCAA as we're talking about the subject of college basketball or college football, and he highlights the fact that in minor league baseball or in hockey, such rules are not applicable, or at least the ire of the public at large isn't the same as it is focusing on these kids in these two respective sports, being football and basketball. That's where race comes into the equation, because it's not necessarily about the rules. It's about the question, where's the uproar? Why is it that we insist upon these rules being implemented against sports that are predominantly African American, but when it comes to sports that are not, suddenly it's not as much as of a priority? Why is a kid coming out of school early and going straight to the pros a subject of even conversation? But when it comes to tennis players who are playing tennis since they were 13 or 14 years of age, or hockey players bypassing college, or baseball players bypassing college and going through the minor league system and getting paid a few $100s, why isn't that as much
Can
of
I
a
answer
subject?
that question, Stephen
Why
A?
is it? Sure,
May I answer
please.
that question? Because, okay,
Sure.
we've offered up, Stan Van Gundy has offered up that the reason for that difference between hockey, baseball, and basketball, football is race. I think there are two other pretty obvious reasons. Max pointed to one. For basketball and football, they're treating the NCAA, they're treating it as their star-making vehicle. So those organizations, the NFL and the NBA, they want to keep the NCAA healthy. They want it to develop stars for them. But secondarily, hockey and baseball have really developed minor league systems. Basketball and football do not have that. So a high school player who's not ready gets washed out really quickly. Those other two sports, they have places to go to keep developing.
Well, I agree with that.
Hold on, Max. Hold on, Max. Here's the deal. Will, I get where you're coming from, but some would argue that the minor league baseball system is more of a star developing system than college baseball is, all right? That's number one. But number two, and more importantly, keep this in mind, Will, and I've said this to you on many occasions. Sometimes you're very black and white with a particular subject. It is what it is. Well, that's in your head. And other people, they might think of it differently. You have folks within the African-American community that have been lamenting exactly what Stan Van Gundy has alluded to on many, many occasions, spanning decades. And these are the kind of things that you have to pay attention to. So you can make the argument, and I'm not saying definitively that you're wrong, because I can't say that, because you can't legislate, nor can you read into what's in somebody's heart. I totally understand where you're coming from. So yeah. But what I'm saying is, even though you can't read into what's in these people's hearts, you can read into the detrimental effect it's had on a plethora of folks from a minority community and how they feel about it. And that can't be ignored either, because you're saying, well, you can't prove that. You don't know that definitively. Well, folks know how their lives are affected by it. If you can go to minor leagues and you can make X amount of dollars and nobody cares. But if you try to do that in the sport of basketball or football, somebody's having a problem with you. If you can sit up there, I'll take finances and stuff out of the equation. In baseball, Will, dugouts empty, folks get into fights, right? In hockey, you're fighting. If you fight in the sport of basketball, it's thuggery, it's criminal activity.
Yeah, I get
what's
that.
wrong? So those are the kind of things that Stan Van Gundy and others are alluding to, because there's a discrepancy in terms of how things are interpreted and ultimately disseminated that can't be ignored. That's not fair. That's not fair.
If I may,
Sure.
Will, there are assumptions about race made unconsciously, including by the victims of those assumptions. It's not just the perpetrators of our original sin, but also the victims. We as a country make assumptions about race. Internalized oppression exists. And I agree with you about ageism in unions. And I agree with you that also, I imagine that your argument may go something like the specific kind of form of minor leagues versus college, et cetera. It could have things to do with, you know, the fact that one culture came out of the Rust Belt or rural environment, whatever. There are all kinds of labor unions had a stronger kind of tradition, you know, from the families that produced baseball players. Like, there are all kinds of arguments that could speak to the proximate causes for what we're talking about. I'm not talking about the proximate causes. I'm talking about the lower level assumptions that allow for those proximate causes. As Stephen A. points out, I don't think it's coincidental that these things, that the perception of fighting, of amateurism, etc., in baseball and hockey, which are predominantly white, are very different from basketball and football, which are predominantly African-American.
Just to clarify, no doubt. And I'm not here to argue that there aren't different assumptions made with different sports based upon race. I wouldn't argue that. And that's why I won't address the fighting point. But my overarching point is this, and this is the sin that Stan Van Gundy committed. When there are obvious reasons, by the way, the most obvious reason in society, things motivated by green, money. You don't have to go making assumptions and peering into people's souls to attribute the worst of motivations to how things turn out, i.e., is it racist? He didn't even have his target right. It's not the NCAA, it's the NBA.
But at the end of the... Go ahead,
my response is I totally get where you're coming from, but you're not the one on the opposite side of the fence suffering from these folks' actions and the rules that they implement. So while I understand where you're coming from, Will, and it's perfectly understandable and fair, you have to take into account those who are actually being victimized by the very rules we're talking about. And I think that's what Stan Van Gundy was alluding to.
And of course, at the end of the day, we all agree we're not a fan of the one-and-done rule. You included
all three of us, all four of us.
All right, Will, we'll check you out later. Will Kane Show, 3 to 6 Eastern, ESPN News, ESPN Radio. Looking forward to it. After an injury...